and welcome to this Farmers Weekly webinar looking at managing fodder and resources on our farms in volatile climate conditions. I'm joined by an expert panel of speakers today who I will introduce to you very shortly. Before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions that you would like us as a panel to answer for you today, please pop those into the Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen, and we'll get round to addressing those towards the end of the webinar. This will also be available on demand. It is being recorded, so if you have to leave us early or you miss any parts of it, you can catch up again later on. So without further ado, our panel, who's joining us today? We have got Head of Environment Technical, Rachel Matey-Davis from AHDB, Charlie Morgan, Independent Grassland Consultant, Richard Greasley, who's Technical Manager at 4Farmers, and Martin Griffiths, who joins us from NFU Cymru. He is the chair of the Water Quality Review Group and also a dairy farmer in Ceredigion. So to get us started, I will hand over the reins to Rachel. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everybody. So first of all, I feel like I'm possibly the voice of doom and gloom for this, or the scene setter. And for me, it's always really important that we understand the context that we're operating in, rather than just looking at the here and now and what faces us, because I think it's really important in terms of how we approach our planning and actually how we fit things in a really important context. So first of all, my first key message is that obviously we're all driving sort of in terms of how we mitigate on farms. We mitigate against climate change, so looking to reduce our carbon emissions, which obviously usually means it can be more productive, we can be more profitable, which is great. But also it's important to understand that the other side of that sort of climate coin is adaptation, or resilience. And it's really fundamental that we're both looking at climate mitigation, but at the same time looking at climate adaptation and resilience. And actually, fantastically, most of the things that you look for resilience are actually really helpful for mitigation too. And I think that's really important to hold tight of, because actually it means that we're getting a win-win from those actions that we can do on farm. So I think, first of all, I always like to look sort of big picture, and this is sort of long-term scope. And, I don't want to make anyone choke on their cornflakes at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, but, we're looking and talking about sort of mid-century onwards. So 2050 onto 2100, and I know that feels bananas at the moment, but actually we all know how quickly time goes. It's really important that when we're thinking about our businesses that we're looking further ahead, we're looking for the next generation and actually the generation after that as well. And I think it comes as no surprise that actually as we go through this century, particularly towards mid-century, the climatic impacts are actually only going to get more challenging for us. Obviously, it is interlinked with a trajectory on emissions, so it's really key to understand how our emissions and actually perhaps how important it is to reduce our emissions and the impact on. But we could be looking by 2070, for example, summers could be +6 degrees warmer than we're experiencing at the moment. It could be 60% drier. Our winters could be up to 4.5 degrees warmer and 30% wetter. So, I mean, this is what we're looking at, and this is all modelled, obviously. But I think it starts to set that agenda in terms of what we're facing long term. And I think it's really key that we start to have a picture on the short, medium and long term when we're looking at our business planning. I think as well, right, let's just focus on to now. So I've done the big picture, and I think it's really important that we maintain that focus in terms of where we're heading in terms of our climatic weather patterns. But actually, if we also look to this year, and I think, and obviously AHDB, we cover cross sector, so we're beef and lamb, we're dairy, we're cereal and oilseeds, and we're pork. We cover different sectors in different nations in the UK, obviously everybody in England, but it's really important to know that actually in England that there are still drought statuses. We're in October and there are still areas within the country that are actually technically in drought status still. I think that's really fundamental. So quite a chunk of the Midlands up to the northeast, northwest, and also the east, and also we've got some other areas that are still in prolonged dry weather, and that's the classification. And this is government data that came out last week, so this is really up to date. And despite having some recovery rainfall in September, our reservoir levels are still nowhere near where they need to be. And also, I suppose, other than today, I think Martin was commenting on the drizzle before, we've only had, it's only the last couple of days that the rains have returned. And actually, we've had a pretty dry 3 weeks, I think, of October. So it's really key and fundamental to understand actually how we are now. So we're not only just recovering still from those drought impacts in the summer, but also we're heading into a winter with actually pretty low reserves in terms of water. And it's remembering it's that broader infrastructure for water. So not just how it just affects us on farm, but actually how it affects us as a total population, because it has a knock-on effect in terms of abstraction, for example. I'm still aware that there are a lot of restrictions on abstraction license, particularly in the east of the country at the moment. So I think it goes without saying it's been a really challenging year. And I think what we need to remember is that we go from these drastic dry sort of summers, sometimes winters, to actually really wet, soggy. I mean sort of the spring of 2024 was, well, it was one of the longest, wettest seasons I think we've ever experienced. From basically August to April, we had more or less non-stop rain. So it is about how these weather patterns now come to affect us and how we start to plan. So, and that's the fundamental. It's remembering that because it's affecting us in the short term, the medium and the long term, it's really important we start to adapt our farming businesses now, that we assess the opportunities in terms of where we can pre-plan, where we can make them more resilient and make them work for us at that farm level as well. It's really key that we start to address that now. So at AHDB, I'm really fortunate. I've got some amazing colleagues that work very closely on climate adaptation. So my colleague Alice Sin really leads this work for us across sector, and she brings together a team across AHDB, which is really fundamental. So it means that we're delivering for all our levy payers. But I think it's really important. We're actually going to be in the new year releasing some climate sort of risk assessment. So you can really, it's a practical tool that you can really start to look at your farm and utilize this as a tool to understand actually where are the risk areas, and it's covering things like, infrastructure, buildings, tracks, access to fields, things that sometimes people don't think about. We perhaps just think about resilience of our soils, of our crops, of our stock, but actually it's think about that whole farm. So we'll be releasing this in the new year as a real practical tool. We also have some really great resources on our website at the moment as well. So I think I don't want to scare everybody in terms of, but we all know this is happening. And I think it's about pre-planning, it's about knowing where our risks are, knowing where the opportunities are as well. And then hopefully fellow panelists will add on some other more sort of practical layers. So thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you, Rachel, for that. I will hand you over to Charlie now. Charlie, independent grassland consultant. Charlie, from your experience, the weather has been challenging, a complete and utter contrast to what we have seen last year. What's some of the practical advice that you have for our farmers on how they can better manage their fodder and resources on their farms?
Well, thank you, Anne. Yes, it has. I mean, the erratic rainfall patterns and the prolonged dry spells that we've been seeing and the general difficult weather conditions are challenging our traditional standard farming practices. I suppose producing enough forage or fodder for livestock, which is more my line of work, is more difficult. And farmers who have followed calendars are now realizing they're becoming completely useless. So decision making is something that has to improve. Some of our decision making on farm obviously is daily or weekly, but the baseline has to be a good practice, which is long-term based strategies. And if I focus on the things that I'm more involved with, which are day-to-day issues, is soil husbandry and the management of grassland and other forage crops. And these two, especially the soils, underpin everything basically in a livestock enterprise. And from my own experience of working with the farming industry, they're ones that conjure up the least respect, especially the soil. It's a boring entity to talk about. Many grassland farms don't really see the soil unless they've done the soil damage from winter poaching. So it's something that they don't want to address that easily. And of course, we've always had this opportunity to cover the problem with a bag of this or a bottle of that, extra ton of feed or whatever it happens to be, can hide that poor management practice. And we've got away with it. But now climate is exposing our shortcuts. With extreme flood and extreme drought, shallow soils, then of course we're all going to be taken. But with just heavy rainfall and dry spells, which, let's face it, okay, we're suffering, but not like the rest of the world. We are dealing with dry spells, not real droughts. And some farmers deal with this better than others. And as you travel around the countryside, you see some green areas and some burnt areas. And you think, well, what are these guys doing differently within the same locality that is getting them through some of this? And what are they doing differently? If we look at some of the practical things they're doing, and these are basic things, they're soil testing. They're having a knowledge of what their soil chemistry is doing. They're having a knowledge of what is the right thing to apply at the right time in the right place. One of the examples would be some of the soil samples I see around the countryside are low in potash, low in potassium. And that's traditionally across silage fields. And they're never getting it addressed. And yet that potassium is regulating the flow of water through the plant, opening and closing the stomata on the back of the leaves, conserving the plant, being able to conserve that water and increase its drought tolerance and ability to grow under stress conditions. So there's something we can do simply by just doing those type of things. They're also aware of their soil textures. They know what their trafficability and workability of some of these soils are, what their stocking density is going to be able to be held on that particular field. And of course, these change across the farm and within fields. So having a knowledge of your soil texture. They're also aware of their soil physical status. They're doing visual inspections of their soil structure. They're aerating the ground if it needs to be aerated. It's having better water holding capacity. It's holding water through the summer because it's actually penetrated into the soil horizons, and it's draining out better when we're having that heavy rainfall through the winter. I'm always listening to the weatherman who says the cities are flooding because the fields and the soils are saturated. And yet I go out there with my spade and the top 3 inches is soaking wet and running off. But below that, it's dry as a cork. So there's definitely ways that we can try and hold water much, much better within our soils. And some of that comes down to the soil biology. When we get the soil biology working better for us, these farmers are using regular inputs of quality organic matter, the farm-made manures. Or if they are using slurry, they're using it in a better manner, in a better way, with better types of machinery, that knowledge and technology that's come to help us. And another major thing is pH. A lot of people are now addressing their pH and their liming policies better, depending where you are in the country, of course. But getting that pH more accurately is paying dividends to the soil biology. They're also using, once they've addressed the soils and got those working well, so you've got a decent baseline to grow on, they're using the diversity of plants that are available to us. And they're also using the new genetics that are out there in terms of drought-tolerant species, deeper rooting capacity of grasses and forages. They're using them in combinations. They're using whole crops mixed with legumes. They're making enough forage, and they're also making enough drier forage, like hay, that can conserve over a longer period of time when difficulties arise. They're using the multi-species type options with a deeper rooting. And I mean, there's hundreds of types out there, so you have to find the ones that are best suitable. They're also using the hedge lines well. A lot of good farms still have their hedges in place. They've got trees sensibly positioned, so we say, to help mitigate along some of the climate difficulties that we're having. They don't plough as often. I'm not against ploughing by any means, but they don't plough as often. They direct drill and they overseed. And then on top of that, they're very careful about their grazing management. They're using rotational grazing strategies, which are variable across the country. It has to fit your locality and your farm type. So rotational grazing is different wherever you go, potentially, depending on your rainfall. But they record it and they plan it and they base their decisions ahead on the data that they create. And there's data opportunities out there, programs available that will help you not only just decide, do I need more fertilizer, what height my grass is, that sort of thing, but would I be better selling off store animals now than taking them to finish? These type of things are useful. So these guys take advice. They also share their knowledge. They test it out. They learn to adapt from these changing conditions. And when you put all these small, relatively insignificant changes together, they make a large impact on the way that we can help mitigate against climate. There we go, Anne.
Charlie, thank you for that. That was really useful, especially the sort of the advice on making sure that you understand your soils. I think that is a message that we're hearing over and over again in the conversation of like being fodder secure, growing better grass, growing more nutritious grass, and just being a little bit better prepared. So thank you for that. Richard, technical manager at 4Farmers. Your experience the last 2 years, again, we have seen the almost two extremes of the spectrum, from flooding to drought. In your experience, how are farmers best to manage that?
Yeah, thanks, Anne, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I think I'm probably going to overlap a little bit with Charlie there because he's made some really good points about the soil in particular. It's a finite resource, and we've got to make sure we keep hold of it. And a colleague of mine years ago, I think it takes thousands of years to produce that 1 centimetre of soil and 5 minutes for it to wash down the road. So the soil is the key to everything. And looking after that is absolutely critical for sure. So I was just going to sort of split my bit into sort of 3 areas really, looking at grassland resistance and perhaps a bit of diversity, a little bit of management and stocking rates, which Charlie's touched on already, and also a touch on soil management again, which Charlie has also highlighted. But I suppose the thing to do is flexible. As Charlie said, the calendar before, you were looking at, you cut silage on this date, you plant cereals on this date, you plant your maize on this date. We've just got to be more flexible with everything. And I think one that I've seen a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people are doing it already, is perhaps using fermentable whole crop as a flex if you're on a mixed farm. Just trying to build those forage stocks up. Normally in a year where grass doesn't go quite so well, the maize does pretty well, but having that flexibility of having whole crop is a good option. Worst case scenario, you can always take it through to grain and sell the grain. If we're looking at grassland mixtures in terms of the grass that we plant, do we looking for example deeper rooting plants? Ryegrass plus would be an example perhaps of that, which you can use in your swards, possibly using a few herbs too, which tend to be deeper rooting to be able to resist drought. But also both of those have the advantage of a deep root structure, which helps the soil structure too. I guess the biggest thing is to measure and manage your forage stocks and also your grazing, which Charlie touched on. As I said, there is an opportunity there to see how much you've actually got coming through. If you can manage and identify those shortfalls early, if needs be, you can start buying alternatives to fill that forage gap quickly and earlier on. In these situations, feed only tends to get more expensive, so get in there early and take advantage of those early moist feed contracts, for example. Whether you look at doing a multi-cut system on farm with your silages, it means you can start a bit earlier. And in general, they tend to produce slightly better quality product and also tend to get an earlier yield boost if it's going to be drought later on in that season. Not that that it's definitely going to be coming, but you can manage if it is. Good clamp management, making sure you perhaps use an inoculant to reduce any losses. Once you've grown it, let's not waste it. Make sure you've got good consolidation when you harvest the crop. Again, trying to reduce losses. People often say, a contractor will say, "Oh yes, I've done 1,000 tons for you." Well, you're going to lose 10% of that minimum in silage losses. I would imagine, possibly even 15. And if you're not making your silage well, it could be 20, 25%. Well, that is just throwing money down the drain. Good clamp management itself, making sure you move across the face quickly. Making sure that the clamp is airtight. Again, trying to make sure you don't have any losses. I suppose one actually when you're making the silage is don't cut the grass too short. So again, you can get good regrowth, quick regrowth. We've all seen it where only be your neighbours. I'm sure those that are on the webinar that do this, but you go down the lane and you see white or even yellow fields after it's been mown. that's going to take an extra week or 2 weeks to regrow, where leaving a slightly longer plant enables it to go better. I've touched on it already. Do you use cover crops after your maize? For example, planting ryegrass after maize can be a risky strategy, but it has worked on a number of units. You may not get perhaps quite the level of dry matter per hectare of each crop, but dry matter per hectare in total can be higher by putting in ryegrass or Westerwolds after your maize. So do you look at choosing a slightly earlier variety of maize harvest so you can get that cover crop in later? And also, that cover crop will stop bleaching of soil itself. As I said earlier, takes 1,000 years to make plus, and also it will keep nutrients in the soil too, which will be better for the following crop. Charlie touched on it too in terms of stocking rates. Align your stocking rates and your density with feed availability. If needs be, reduce your stocking levels. Look at taking out cool cows early. A longer term strategy, if you're not already doing it, perhaps look at 2-year calving rather than 3-year, or the national average is around about 2.5, I guess. But can you reduce that so you're not carrying so many stock to replace cows that leave the herd? In wet weather, can we ensure that the fields aren't poached? And I think Charlie touched on it, or Anne, even in your intro, was gateways are just as important as the rest of the field, because if your gateway gets larger and larger because you've poached it, you've got less land to produce that forage on. What else have we got? Flexible grazing plans. Charlie touched on that. I think that's really critical to allow grass to regrowth. If you can do a paddock grazing system, tend to get more dry matter yield per hectare. Any rotational grazing is better than set stocked if you can do it, because it just gives that time for the grassland to recover. Regular reseeding. After 5 years, a crop that's been down can have 50% of the production of a new year lay. So keeping on top of your reseeding is critical. Good soil structure, which Charlie's touched on already, in terms of better infiltration of when there is a lot of water about, and helps prevent flooding. Flooding itself causes compaction. I can't remember the number, but I think it's somewhere like 10,000 tons or something per hectare. If you have a meter of flood water on top of it, that's a lot of weight on that soil and a lot of compaction. So subsoiling, as I touched on earlier, the ryegrass plus with the deep rooting systems, again, will help that soil structure. And as Charlie, as I said, made it really clear, avoid that compaction, look after your soil. And that's probably me with my list of things I scribbled down to talk about. So I hope that helps, and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Richard. Lots to take away from that there, definitely. Interesting fact as well about the flood compaction and the weight that has on soils, which is, perhaps not something that we always think about in that sense. Talking of managing grasslands, and also, I suppose, the important role of managing nutrients to grow better grass and using that, we also briefly talked about getting rid of that farming by calendar. That farming by calendar no longer works. So with farming by calendar in mind, I will hand over to Martin Griffiths, who is the NFU Cymru Chair for the Water Quality Review Group. With Wales being declared a whole NVZ zone, there are some different challenges for farmers in Wales to manage climate change and volatile climate conditions all in their own right. Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, well, I think listening to Charlie, Richard, and Rachel speak, they're echoing a lot of what we've been doing here on farm. Initially, when we were started to expand the dairy herd to where we are now, we quickly realised we would be facing an issue if we carried on the same system as we were operating originally, where we would be going into forage deficits mid-season. That resulted in us putting a plan together where we decided to move towards an autumn calving system. It was the milk price encouraged that, but more importantly for us, it gave us the opportunity to match our demand for grass in our grass-based system to that curve that we've all seen over the years. We now begin calving in August, and we try and really to mitigate what we've seen previously. 2018, 2022, we've had prolonged periods of rain, dry periods, sorry. This year, we've had periods of dry weather. May saw growth rates drop down to about 25 kilos of dry matter a day when we had demand for 60. So you can see we were quickly going to be finding ourselves short of forage. And again, in August, we found that happening. By changing these bits and pieces, we've seen ourselves through this. I readily admit we have not seen the prolonged dry weather that many of you will have seen further east, and I can only sympathise with your situation. But this year, we do seem to be operating throughout the UK in a series of microclimates, and again, that as Anne said, that system of one size fits all is definitely not the case now. And the strength that we do have as an industry is the fact that we all as individuals can adapt our own systems to mitigate what's happening. And I think giving us all that confidence and strength and information to do that is going to be key moving forward. As Anne said, we here in Wales operate in a slightly different way with the devolved administration that we have got now with our payments and payment schemes. Because let's all be honest, the payment schemes they are there as a safety net that have been there as a safety net to keep us to help mitigate these shocks as they come along, be that trade, climate, or diseases. And I think it's paramount that governments of whatever country recognise this going forward. We in Wales here are fortunate that I think we've been able to persuade Welsh Government to put a scheme together that is fundamentally a good scheme in the fact that it recognises all the different challenges that we face. But as always, the devil will be in the detail. And if those details aren't addressed as and when they arise, we could well see tranches of the industry walking away from the scheme, which I think would be a very, very poor and sad situation, because if governments lose that ability to influence agriculture going forward for the greater good, we may well find ourselves in a weaker position. The new SFS scheme that we have in Wales hinges in the first place on universal actions. And one of those universal actions is the requirement to soil test 20% of our ground every year. A good thing. But the narrative around that has cast doubt for some people because of the need to centralize that data capture. And this is, for me, one of the critical things going forward. A good idea can be spoilt in a poor narrative, and people take up when these ideas and schemes are being sold to us as primary producers. The narrative and the way it is put over is going to be critical, because then people will engage with what that conversation is. One of the challenges we do face here, and it is probably the same over the border in England, Scotland and in Northern Ireland, is the need, quite rightly, for an eye to be cast on the environment and habitats. We have a requirement here to be running 10% of our ground as habitat ground. In principle, that is fine. But the practicalities of this in a changing climate situation does mean that there needs to be flexibility within government for change. We cannot get into the situation where people's stock are short of food because the piece of paper says we can't graze that ground. We cannot get to the situation where the weather is good, a forage crop needs to be taken, but the date tells us we can't do it until next week when the rain comes. We need to be able to work into these systems. Governments need to be flexible going forward and need to be able to react to the situation on the ground the same as those primary producers are doing. If we come to the situation, as Anne said, I lead on the water quality within Wales. We have become, even this year was this farcical situation where the ground conditions were brilliant. Grass was growing, and up until from last Tuesday to Saturday, the conditions were excellent for spreading slurry, but the paper said no. The paper said no. We need some sort of common sense in that scenario, because otherwise people lose faith in our political leadership, and when that confidence is lost, we find ourselves in a much poorer place. I think as NFU Cymru, we welcome what has been done in a scheme, but I think going forward we need to have that flexibility and that ability to adapt the systems to the situation on the ground, because as we've seen this year, last year, and in previous years, things change from year to year. There isn't a typical year, and if Rachel's doomsday scenario goes forward, we will need to adapt far quicker and be far more nimble of foot as we move forward. And that goes for us as producers. We will need to make changes, but that also goes for our political leadership and in the way that they operate. They need to be fleet of foot as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Again, I think for me there, the big takeaway is that political flexibility to allow the industry to function. Right. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions and for your presentations so far. Quick reminder to the audience, if you do have any questions you want the panel to address that they haven't already, please pop those into the Q&A box on your left. So we've already had some pretty good questions come through. So I think let's start with one of those, and I'll go to Rachel. I'll go to you first on this one. What research do you think is needed to help farmers cope with climate change?
That's a really good question. And I suppose, obviously, HDB, we're an evidence-based organisation. I actually work in quite a big sort of research part of the organisation. And, research is absolutely fundamental. And I think for me, it's about research on sort of real farms and actually how it affects real farmers. And I think quite often we see a lot of perhaps research based in slightly artificial circumstances, and I think for me it's really important that we continue that, and that's important, but also that we do more research on actual farms. And I think it's also in that translation for research, actually, what does that mean at farm level? What does a farmer need to do? And I think sometimes we lose track of that in terms of that dialogue. But for me, it probably goes back to what Martin was saying, I think, and Martin's a really good advocate in terms of the beauty of our agricultural systems in the UK is that no two fields are the same, let alone no two farms. And it's really about understanding, therefore, what works for you. And I think it's really important, therefore, that, research is really useful at us understanding that sort of top level impacts. But actually then, as a farmer, it's about taking those little bits of jigsaw from different research that then you think could apply to your farm. And I think perhaps one final thought as well, and this is, this isn't research based at all, but it's also about, should have said, I always like to get it. I also farm, so beef and sheep farmer, and it's also seeing your own farm as a little bit of an experiment too, in terms of the scale and actually what works on your own farm. So I know that's not technical research and we wouldn't be writing papers about that, but I think sometimes it's about understanding actually what works for you. And actually, if it doesn't work, don't be worried about it not working. Try something else and actually, pull on your advisors, like Charlie, like Richard, utilize that sort of those as advisors as tools in terms of doing your own sort of farm-based research too.
Thank you, Rachel. I've got another question that's come up here, and I think this is probably one for Charlie and Richard. So deeper rooting for all crops and grass should help grazing and fodder resilience. Does using the discipline of a plate meter, removing livestock from field while still having 1,500 dry matter in the field to encourage the plant to get growing again help? Does that make sense? Are we clear there? So do we use a plate meter, and do we need to remove livestock from fields when dry matter is running at 1,500? Charlie, I'll go to you first.
Okay. Yes, plate meters are great methods of measuring your sward, knowing your dry matter, and 1,500 kilos of dry matter would be a target point to remove stock, because, as Richard said before, the same as silage cutting, if you graze it too hard and remove too much of the foliage, then your regrowth is going to be massively slowed, because your leaf is a photosynthesis panel, basically grabbing the sunlight. If you graze it off, then it's not going to grow back very quickly because it's not getting the energy from the sunlight. So a target of 1,500 is a general agreed point. It could be a little bit higher on some occasions, and I think the question is talking about deep rooting plants. Well, if it's grass, it still applies. If it's some of more of our broadleaf species like the chicories and the plantains, the calibrations of the plate meter aren't set up for that type of material. The dry matter content of these plants is quite significantly different. So they haven't been calibrated to the same level, but you can still use that plate meter to understand. You'll be able to calibrate it yourself from your own experience, or you could just take a known sample, dry it, use your microwave, dry it, know what your dry matter levels are within that crop. Then you can recalibrate yourself to know when to move things around. I did sort of mention in my presentation, as different places within the country, it can be different. So sometimes we talk about mob stocking, letting a lot more biomass grow up because you might only get one chance of growing it. When I visited a guy called Gabe Brown in North Dakota, he would grow 29 different species in one area. They would be up to the shoulders of the cattle, and he would be grazing that through the summer, but he'd have one chance of growing it. With us at the minute, we're in most of the UK, we're having chance to regrow on a rotational grazing platform. But if it gets drier, as it has done in the east, we'll be growing one very large crop of biomass, and therefore our plate meters don't really come into play. We'll be doing it more visually and cutting to know what we've got.
Thank you, Charlie. Richard, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, I think Charlie's covered that off pretty well. I mean, the 1,500, 1,600 kilos per hectare dry matter to take stock out, perhaps slightly higher if it is going to be dry, but it's measuring it, isn't it? At the end of the day, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So, and the plate metering gives you a good idea of what's coming in the next few weeks, so you can plan accordingly to adjust your stocking levels like we discussed earlier if needs be. So, but yeah, I think Charlie covered it off well there.
Thank you, Richard. But you're not off the hook just yet, because I think this next question has got your name written all over it. If we are to have long, hot summers, which annual spring sown forage crops are best able to survive and produce yields? Is that one you're happy to take, Richard?
I'll probably pass that to Charlie, actually, being more
Pass that to
an
Charlie.
agronomist. But I mean, there are. It probably does depend on where you are, doesn't it? For me, in the geography I cover, it's probably more autumn where we can get the longer shoulder, shall we call it, by using some root crops, forage rape, stubble turnips, the usual sort of suspects, I suppose. But Charlie might have an idea for spring crops.
Well, we haven't covered a point of things like pest and disease. These issues are becoming increasingly more troublesome as climate is changing. We're all aware of our animal issues, but of pests and diseases, but it's happening in the plants as well. So we need to be looking at crops that are more resistant, and we've had quite a bit of trouble with the brassica type crop at the moment with flea beetle and no sprays to control that and type of thing. Spring sown crops, well, your cereals, if the conditions are right to go in, once they get their roots down deep enough, I mean, the roots go deep on dry conditions. So that's a good thing for when it dries out more, that those rooting depths of your cereals can be better. The one that springs to mind is fodder beet, maybe as an alternative, because once that gets away and gets those roots right down, it's pretty resilient in drought conditions. It's done very well in the last couple of years. But it's about having cover at all times. What we've been very guilty of is having exposed soils. And once you've got exposed soils, when it's dry, they bake out quickly. When it's wet, they erode quickly. So again, Gabe Brown was a guy who said soils have to be covered. And he's absolutely right. We need some form of cover all the time. So in terms of what Richard said in following your maize, we would be pushing very hard to have a autumn sown Italian ryegrass or something to cover that soil, to protect it through the winter, to have something coming out in the spring. And really, you've got potential silage crops then right the way through to the following autumn if you wanted, or to take out when the conditions are right to follow with another crop. So it's whatever suits your area, but it needs to be something.
I've even had people use cereals after maize and harvest in the spring as a grass crop, rather than
like
taking it through to fermentable whole crop, because again, it just gives you that flexibility, deep rooting, and also being blunt about it, availability of seed. You know, we were out of ryegrass and Westerwold quite quickly for a period this year, so we could perhaps do a build up of seed stocks as well, as a generalization as for agriculture. But yeah, it's perhaps what's available, as well as thinking about what would be good to grow.
Yeah, if I could come back in there as well. Yeah, things like oats have been very well used and traditionally were used. Rye again, but as you say, there's quite a shortage happening across the country now. And for Martin with his political hat, some of these things are SFI driven and that type of thing, where demand has been increasingly going up and the supply isn't there.
Thank you both for that. Now, when we talk about the climate and the weather, I know that there are some people who are not 100% convinced that we are seeing climate change, that we have got changing weather patterns. So one of the questions that has come through here, and I'll pass this one over to you, Rachel, is how important are carbon audits and action plans to counter climate skepticism in agriculture?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think because I've got a misspent youth in terms of doing carbon audits and carbon action plans, I feel like I can probably quite confidently talk about this. And I think for me, they're part of the picture, or they're part of the jigsaw, and they're really important. And I think especially the action plan, I'd actually argue the action plan is much more important than the figure that you get from the carbon calculation. I mean, it's a really useful baseline for your farm, having that figure, but actually what you need to do for your particular farm, and it goes back to that point again in terms of it's got to be farm specific, it's got to be farmer specific actually. So does it work for you as a farmer? Does it work on your farm? And that action plan is absolutely fundamental in terms of actually not only what can you do in terms of mitigating carbon emissions, but also how you can then start to adapt, because like I said earlier, they're two in the same thing. So I think that's really key. But it's important, though they have a really vital role in terms of that. I still think that there's other bits of the jigsaw that need to perhaps break down some of the barriers that farmers feel in terms of engaging with this subject. So for me, it probably goes back to some of the comments about research as well. It's about making it really, first of all, making the language clear, but also making it relevant to farmers. Actually, what does it mean to us as farmers, but also as human beings as well? I think we also sometimes need to remember that we're also humans as well as farmers, and how it impacts us. So for me, it's a really important part of the picture in terms of how we try and myth bust carbon a little bit and try and reduce some of the skepticism around it, but it's not the be all and end all. So for me, it's about, transparency, information, but in language that we can all understand. I think is really key. But also, we need to take farmers with us on this journey, so it can't be top down. We've got to engage and actually listen and utilize that farmer knowledge as well around sort of carbon and how it impacts our systems.
Thank you, Rachel. I've got another one here that's probably for Charlie and Richard. I'll leave you to decide who jumps on this one. What are the pros and cons of subsoiling and or slitting on soil health and biology? Don't all go at once.
I think Charlie's he was on mute, but I could see his lips moving.
I think Exact is not good. I'm happy to take that. The pros and cons of subsoiling. Well, subsoiling and aeration are two different types of things. Subsoiling is working at depth, and sometimes that is deeper than it needs to be. So again, it's about exploring where your issues are. So from a grassland point of view, as a grassland type of work, usually soil damage doesn't get below 6 or 7 inches, 20 odd centimeters. And usually an aerator can be adequate to fix the problem. The important point is knowing where that compaction zone is. So as we said, rainfall can cause a lot of damage in compaction. That'll be on the surface. If it's sheep, it's the top inch, cattle 3 inches, machinery 4 to 5 inches. And then after that, it's deeper, it's crops like maize and potatoes and things like that will create those sort of damages at a lower level. So it depends what your enterprises are. If you go in with a subsoiler where you don't need to, you could create a lot more damage than is necessary because it's a much bigger machine. If you go in with an arable subsoiler onto a grassland field, then you're definitely going to create a lot more damage than you need to. So it's about knowing the right machine for the right job. There is some data showing, it's AHDB data actually, showing work with subsoilers. If they're used annually, they actually will push your production backwards because they are that damaging that it knocks you backwards before you come forwards. So if it's an annual operation, you actually lose production. They don't recommend you use subsoilers more than 1 year in 3. If it's aeration with a slit knife aerator, providing it breaks through the compaction point. If it doesn't, it just creates another pond on your farm and it fills up with water and gets worse. If it breaks through the compaction point, then the HDB data showed on a dairy farm in a rotational grazing system that the first month it's done, you might get a 10% loss in production, but by the time you're coming around for the second grazing, you'll have gained that 10% back and more. So aeration is important, but it's the soil biology that actually does the real work. So those aeration bits of metal, they're only there to help the biology get a chance to repair itself by getting air and water back into the soil. And hopefully once it's established well enough, they can look after themselves. It's just a matter if you're heavily stocked or the winter conditions are bad or the rainfall's bad, have you damaged it again? So you need to fix it again.
Thank you, Charlie. Another question that has come through on the chat, and again, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box, is one on flood schemes. So how can farmers, and I don't mind who jumps on this one, how can farmers be more actively involved in shaping and supporting Environment Agency or local council flood schemes to ensure they not only protect communities, but also enhance on-farm resilience? So farmer involvement in designing flood schemes. Who would like to make a start on that one?
I mean,
Rachel.
I don't mind popping into this. It's a really good point, and I think the broader point is as well. It's about remembering that that as farmers we've got a really key role, not only in terms of combating the climate crisis and nature crisis, but actually how we can mitigate against sort of flood prevention, how we can help in terms of flood prevention, in terms of water quality as well. And I think it's really important to remember that we can actually play these really quite key important roles in terms of how we can again help broader society. And I think it's a really good point in terms of how we get farmers more engaged with that process early on. So for me, and like both Martin and Charlie, I'm also in Wales, and I think it depends sometimes where you are in the country as well, and actually in terms of how your sort of government structure, your local government structure is. But I know for us, being from a Welsh context, is we're really lucky that we've got great access to policymakers in the Devolves. It's much easier than it is, say, in England, and I think sometimes utilise that. So utilise those relationships, utilise access to policymakers. To demonstrate that actually that we can be part of the solution. So I think sometimes having that positive attitude and going towards saying, look, on my farm, I actually want to be part of this solution. How can you help me? So I think that's the first step. I think there's also, no matter where you are in the country, in which nation you're in, there's also an opportunity through local groups, through catchment groups, through cluster working. There's all these different elements that actually you can absolutely proactively be part of. So I think probably sometimes the biggest barriers perhaps is our own attitude in terms of trying to engage and demonstrating we can be part of it. So I would encourage any farmer, and actually probably most farms can play a role in this no matter where you are. Because I mean, going back to my doomsday scenario, so I'm jumping around a bit, but actually the projections over the next few years for flooding in England are pretty bold. They're pretty frightening actually in terms of the risk to flooding. And actually there's an open door is what I'm trying to say, and an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we can be part of this solution. So I would suggest that you can do a number of different things in terms of trying to really engage and demonstrate that we can be part of this. And one last point, sorry, jumping around completely, it goes back to I think Charlie saying before about people planting trees and hedgerows in the right places on their farms. And again, it goes back that there are opportunities of planting in the right place on farms in terms of helping with sort of flood prevention going forward.
Thank you, Rachel. Do any of the other panelists have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just come in there and say, I think we can be quite easily led by what we see on social media, because some of these pressure groups come out with a lot of negativity towards the industry. But very often, if you were to engage with some of these people, they will, what they are trying to achieve and what we are trying to achieve very, very often are the same. And the narrative, and we can get lost in the narrative. And if we do have the conversations, we can influence stuff. I've always found that when we are talking to our leaders, they are looking for answers, and if we can be the ones to give those answers, they become much more palatable. If we don't engage, we lose that opportunity going forward.
Definitely. Talking of engaging then, I think a question that would be good if we could answer it in the round is, then we're looking at those practical things that we can do on farm, but what political help is there that the industry would benefit from, perhaps? And maybe what are some of those political stumbling blocks that make it more difficult for farms to be resilient and to deal with changing climate? Martin, I'll hand that question straight back to you. So from a political perspective, what help is it that the industry needs there to be climate resilient?
I think firstly, we've all all financial help would be always welcome. We know that goes by the by. But I think recognition for what we are doing already is key. Many of us within the industry know where we stand day in, day out. We are very proud of where we farm and how we farm. And very often we do not get the recognition for what we do. And that ability to recognize that in the round, in the first place, in the conversation, will open far more doors than criticizing, finding fault, and literally blaming everybody else. You know, we will get through this together. I'm going back to what I said in the presentation. I think the speed that we operate as farmers, even though it doesn't feel it, is quite quick. It has to be very quick to react to what the situation on the ground day in, day out. And I think the frustrations many who are dealing with policymakers find is the time it takes for decisions to be made. And by the time those decisions have been made, the whole conversation has moved on. I think sometimes it's that fleet of footness that I mentioned earlier that we need, and we need from policymakers as well as ourselves. And that, I think, will open far more doors than many other options, because then we can react to things, we can put things together at the proper time, in the proper place to move forward. If it has to go to 3 and 4 committees, if it has to come back to be discussed again, if it does move forward, by the time those decisions are made, the conversation has moved on and the opportunity is lost. So I think sometimes it is that ability to, as Rachel said, we're very fortunate in Wales. We do have access to our policymakers, but even in that situation, I think they'd readily admit themselves that it could happen a lot quicker than it is. But because very often when a decision is made, it's relevant to what was happening 3 years ago and not relevant to what's happening today. And if we do move forward at the rate that Rachel is suggesting, that scenario is going to lead to very poor governance and decision going forward.
Rachel, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sort of get into too much sort of political territory, but I think you use a really fundamental word there, Martin. You talk about recognition, and I think for me, it's about that. It is about that recognition, and recognition in terms that actually our farms are part of the solution, and I think that's really powerful. You know, it's remembering that actually, you know, the land-based sector is the only sector that can deliver on a number of things. Really, you know, so, you know, carbon storage, carbon sequestration, sort of flood prevention, food production, all these wonderful things that coexist and that we can stack. So I think it is about that sort of being part of the solution. That recognition for being part of the solution is really powerful. But also I think, and it goes back to Charlie mentioned in his sort of open presentation about, you know, the fact that, you know, we're impacted and we're talking today because actually we want to be in the front foot in terms of climate resilience. But actually, though we are impacted, we're impacted a lot less than other areas in the world. And I think that's something we need to hold on to. And therefore, if we adapt, we could be really smart, because actually we can produce, particularly in terms of our livestock systems, we can produce highly nutritious, sustainable food in a really sustainable way. And actually, as part of the changing climate, which globally that makes us quite powerful, because everybody's climate is changing. Ours is, but probably less so than some other parts of the world. So I think sometimes it's remembering these sort of bigger things again in terms of how they set us up for looking forward, and actually perhaps then how policy mechanisms can support those things as well.
Lovely. Thank you all ever so much. I am conscious of time. We are just coming up to the hour. Just going to go around the panel one more time. Your number one top tip for managing climate change and climate volatility on farm. I know it's a tough one, but your number one tip, Charlie, you're top of my screen. I'll start with you.
You didn't give me much time to think about that one, did you? Should I make it easy for myself? Well, soils are the main part of every business, aren't they? They're the second most important resource on farm. So if you don't get that right, then everything else that we'll talk about building on top is on dodgy foundations. So we have to address those soils. And I think if I just comment about Rachel and Martin's comments just on the last question, our organic matter, we've been told we need to increase our organic matter levels, and that is a good thing. We need to keep doing that. But if we look where we are in the rest of the world, America and Australia have got organic matter levels at 1 to 2% on some of their arable areas, and some of their grassland areas are not much better. Whereas we're recording 6, 7%, and in much of the grassland, 10 double figures of organic matter. We should be recognised for what we're doing. If I can also comment on policy, some of Americans' ideas are insurance policies, which basically make poor farmers even worse farmers because they pay their insurance and they get a massive payout when they fail and they don't even try. So we should be rewarded for what we're doing. And yeah, my main point is soils are king. Everything else depends on the soils.
Thank you, Charlie. Martin, your top tip. Martin, you're on mute. Oh, we'll move, Richard, I'll move on to you while Martin manages his technical difficulty. Your top tip, Richard.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with Charlie. Soil is absolutely key. But then after that, I'd say once you've made it, manage it. Look after that forage. Once you've grown it, conserve it well, manage it well, and reduce your losses and measure. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Martin, shall we try again? Top
tip.
tip.
I'm back. The gremlins were having their go. My top tip, we are individuals. We're running individual businesses. Be proud of what you're doing and move forward. You as individual business owners and managers have the ability to adapt your systems for your environment, for your weather. And I think that is the greatest strength that we have got as an industry. Take on board what others are saying. By all means, keep a weather eye on what is happening, but have the confidence to adapt your systems in the best way possible to mitigate all these challenges that we have. These are challenges going forward. Our forefathers have always faced challenges. And as individuals and managers going forward, we will be in a good place going forward.
And last but by no means least, Rachel, if we conclude the webinar with your top tip.
I've actually got 3. I'm really sorry. Although I'm repeating what Richard and Martin have said. So first of all, it would be about knowing your own numbers. I think that's key. So again, we can't overstate this enough. Know your own data and where you're at. The second thing would be exactly sort of what Martin said, and based on your own data, do what suits your farm, but also what suits you as a person or a family or a business, however your business is structured. It's really key that change suits you as well. So it's also that sort of social aspect. But fundamentally, my third final point, and it's new from these 2 guys, is actually do it now. Don't put it off. So start planning now in terms of how you can make your business more climate resilient. Don't put it off till next year, till 2 years' time, till the next generation take over. Start thinking about it today. Thank you.
Lovely. Panel, thank you all ever so much for your valuable contributions to the discussion here today. Just a quick reminder for those of you who haven't been able to watch all of it, or who had to leave early, or who didn't make it today, this webinar is also available on demand. You can catch up with us again later. Thank you all very much.